So welcome everybody. I'll do a little whip round so everybody can introduce themselves in a second, and I'll try and direct it a little bit, but hopefully we can have a fairly flowing discussion. Just a couple of things to say about the questions. I've realised reading back that they are very kind of tech focused. So please feel free to talk about wider social and community innovations, anything you like. So please don't be too constrained by the focus of those questions. Also, there's a palpable absence of any reference to net zero or sustainability. So similarly, please feel free to comment on those issues as well, given their incredible significance at the moment. So apologies for the narrowness of some of these questions. So I'll just formally introduce myself. I'm Chris Lowe. I'm Associate Dean for Business and Enterprise here in the College of Health, Wellbeing and Life Sciences at Sheffield, Hallam University. Part of my particular interest in innovation is I was the founder of the Business Accelerator at the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre that's been running over the last couple of years. It felt like an interesting time to start it during a pandemic, but it's done phenomenally well, partly due to remote technologies, which I'm sure we'll touch upon during the discussion. So can I turn to Peter first to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Peter O'Brien. I'm Executive Director of Yorkshire Universities. That's the regional higher education network of universities in Yorkshire and the Humber, 12 members. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University. Got a background in local regional development, work with LEPs, local authorities, city regions, regional assemblies when we used to have those, and very much looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks, Peter. Thanks for coming along today. Faye, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm Faye Tomson. I own and run two companies based just outside Sheffield, small businesses. Tomson Consulting, we do carbon management for all sorts of businesses and organisations, and specifically farmers as well, and renewable energy development. And my other business, which is probably more well known, is also really small, district heating, and we develop low carbon horticulture. Yeah, we're growing. You know, we started off just me in my bedroom, and we're now a team of 5. So yeah, it's going okay.
No, it's great to have you along, Faye. And already we can see from the two introductions so far that we're really covering a number of different bases. So as we go around, you'll see just what a great panel it is and how wide-ranging the interest in innovation is. So next up, Ceri.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, so I'm Ceri Batchelder, and I run my own business called Connect and Create. And I tend to work closely with different stakeholders, such as businesses, local government, and the universities, to try and really stimulate collaboration and innovation in the region. And currently I'm working on a couple of projects, and one's actually linked to MIT, and it's called Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Programme. And that's led us to look at lots of different aspects around entrepreneurship and innovation in our region. And I should add, in the other half of my time, I'm working on a technology ecosystem project called Team SY with Capital Enterprise, who are a London-based organisation, bringing a project up to South Yorkshire. Thank you.
Thanks, Ceri, and really appreciate you making the time today. So thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you.
And then Paul.
Hi, yes, I'm the Director of Research at the Dental School, but I also have my own research programme in health technologies extensively with industry. So we do a lot of translation, although I don't have my own business. And formerly, I've also been the Director of the Bioincubator and North Campus Innovation Centres at Sheffield University. So I've got probably, by academic standards, a relatively good insight, but not as good as an industrial person into the innovation process.
Great. It's great to have you along. Thank you, Paul. And Rachel.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Clark. I'm the Director of Trade and Investment for the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. I've recently taken over the remit for investment and innovation in South Yorkshire. So we We're working from a number of different angles, both with partners in South Yorkshire, local authorities and universities, but also from a wider remit with the Northern Powerhouse, and then with a direct link into government. So I'm really interested for the discussion today.
Oh, it's great to have you along. Thanks, Rachel. One thing I did forget, there's very little housekeeping when you do it like this. You don't have to direct people to the toilets or the fire escapes. But if you can just not use the chat, because that won't translate into this being watched back later. So just a little request on that one. So thanks again. I'm going to start with hopefully a teasing question, which goes like this. To paraphrase a famous film producer, innovation is as common as horse manure, but what is rare is the ability to develop and commercialize innovation. Peter, do you agree?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, good question. I guess to me, or for me, this is probably again the question of how you define innovation. And do we define innovation in a more narrow sense of technology transfer, commercialization, not to disparage that because that's incredibly important, or are we broadening our sense of our definition of innovation to encompass innovation in both process and products? And I would probably argue that we need both in the country, and in particular in Yorkshire, if we're going to certainly improve and strengthen productivity, if we're going to tackle inequalities and to address issues around places that have been left behind and people in those places that have been left behind. So I would argue that we need to probably get a very careful and precise definition of innovation, and to probably see that as a more inclusive form of innovation that exists in different areas. What we just need to probably do as those of us who work in the innovation space is to make sure that we're realizing the talent of people who embrace innovation or want to be innovative or more innovative, say such as firms, and they've got access to resources, to finance, to tools, and particularly to markets, which is where Rachel's working in. So I think this lends itself to actually asking the question, how do we define innovation?
Thanks, Peter. I deliberately hadn't asked that question because I didn't want to be accused of being an academic. So I'll open it up more broadly and see what the views are on that one. Ceri, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I can help Peter out there because I wanted to come prepared, and so I looked up MIT's definition of innovation, and it's the process of taking ideas from inception to impact, and that really helps me a lot, because I think, you know, there's lots of ideas floating around, but actually, can we take them to the next step? You know, can we actually, for example, do the research translation if it was from a university, and do that then the next step of commercialization? And in my reflection on that, I was looking at, like, why do we find it so hard? So things that came to mind were aspects such as, you know, the market fit, you know, the traction, you know, is that actually there? I know lots of inventors who've spent ages on their invention and really excited, tweaking everything to make it perfect, and then actually nobody wanted it. So you have to be careful there. And also increasingly the multidisciplinary nature of innovation. So particularly if technology is involved, there's all sorts of skills that you need and capabilities, both from a technical perspective and from a business perspective. And then, you know, aspects such as interoperability, and also companies not having the headspace or the funding actually to take these things forward, and also having that appetite for risk. But the reason why it's important is I used to work in a big corporate, Smith & Nephew, and actually, you know, about a quarter of their revenue came from products that were new to the business over the last 4 to 5 years. So actually, you can see how fundamental it is actually to continuing and surviving in business. But the only other thing I wanted to add was around the fact that there's good news as well. It's not all difficult. And the fact is we've got a lot of organisations that can help in the region, you know, such as the universities, such as the catapults, the local authorities and city region. So there's also reason for optimism, even though innovation is a tough thing. Thanks.
Thanks, Ceri. Faye, any views on this one?
Yeah, so I was scribbling notes while you were talking. I was thinking, what's helped me? What have I needed to get this far with it? Because there's certainly been times where I've sat in my car and cried because it's so hard keeping small businesses going sometimes, and I'm lucky because I'm right on with the timing, like low carbon horticulture, net zero, all this stuff. The timing couldn't be better. I think the basic building blocks that have got me so far have been right from the very beginning. I would say, well, childcare. I would actually thank my mum, which I know there's nothing techie about that, but I'm a woman with a child and there's lots of us, and without help and support with just life outside of work, I wouldn't have got this far. The other thing I would say is my coach, my business coach. He's amazing. I pay him a lot of money. He's worth every penny. I could not have made it here without him. Like, he's shown me how to set up a sales funnel, which keeps the revenue coming in, which allows us to innovate. He helps me with all sorts of problems and challenges I have when I've got to negotiate contracts and just common sense, practical things, mindset, listening to podcasts and stuff like that. When I have a bad day, listening to a podcast about other entrepreneurs and how they deal with it. And they're all saying, yeah, it's just really hard and you've just got to keep going. It's about having that grit and determination and digging deep. And I think I don't want to go too far off piste, but I would say that, and a lot of it all boils down to like state of your mental health and believing in yourself and believing in your dream, doesn't it? And I think really underneath everything, that's the big thing. You're only as effective as how well you feel, aren't you? So I have to work. That's another thing that my coach helps me with, building routines into life, like getting up early, going to bed early, eating properly, meditating, all of that stuff, I think is vital. It probably don't get talked about that much. Yeah.
Oh, that's a really interesting take. Thanks, Faye. And we'll definitely come back to some of the points that have been raised already. Paul, any particular views on this one?
I've always got more views than time, I'm afraid. And I certainly take Faye's point that we often forget the human factor, which is absolutely key and at the heart of everything. But I also forget it. So I tend to look at your question, innovation is as common as horsepreneur. And I don't really agree, but because it comes down again to what we've heard from Peter, that it's down to definition. So I always look at innovation as an academic as quite a late stage. So academics spend a lot of time doing research that just generates new knowledge, which is wonderful stuff, but often not that useful. And it's the translation of that new knowledge into something useful that usually underpins innovation. And where I do differ, but I could be wrong because I'm an academic, is I tend to think of innovation as something that is starting to be commercially successful. Because in the society that we created, where the world is largely dominated by the free market, cash and money is the substance we choose to do the translation and also to measure whether or not our innovation is working. And I know there are some famous examples of innovations that don't make money, but nevertheless are embedded. But on the health tech side where I work, fundamentally, it's that return on the investment that everyone is looking for. And that only really happens at the point of innovation, where the change is taking place, be it a new product or a new process, and that's starting to generate a revenue stream, which feeds back into those things, in fact, Faye alluded to, into more R&D, into more discovery. So so I don't really agree with it, but it's a good controversial start.
Thanks, Paul. Rachel, do you want to come in on this one?
Yes, when you sent that question through, it's an interesting one because I was thinking of it from two different angles. In my mind, innovation is both about the research and development element, but it's also about how firms and businesses innovate. So, the pandemic is a perfect example of how a lot of companies have had to pivot their businesses and bring innovation in and new technologies and new ways of working and new ways of doing business in order to maintain a turnover. So, and it's been really, really interesting, but actually some of the key themes that have come out of that during the past 18 months are being reflected in some of the innovation strategy that's being developed from a Northern Powerhouse perspective. And at the heart of that is about de-risking early stage innovation for more sectors and companies, and then supporting the rapid scale up. So, you know, a lot of companies, SMEs, which is what the UK is built on, but a lot of SMEs, whether they're small or large in that scale, they want to innovate, but they just haven't got their financial resources to bring in new technology, new employment practices, new ways of doing things, because it would cause a disruption from the work that they're currently doing. So I think that there's a whole area of activity that city regions and local governments can play in de-risking some of these areas so that companies can innovate more.
Right, just also jump in, sorry, because it just you reminded me of something I forgot, and that is this ability of business to pivot. It's really challenging. And because I work a bit with Medulink, I was looking at Blue Tree recently in Wath-upon-Dearn, who pivoted to respond to the COVID pandemic, I mean, quite remarkably, when they're really essentially rooted in a print company, and now they manufacture really high quality face mask and protection. So I've completely forgotten, but you're so right, Rachel, that the ability to pivot is a form of innovation in itself. And we're lucky in South Yorkshire to have examples of successful businesses who can do that. Sorry.
Thanks, Paul. Faye, you wanted to come in with your little white hand.
yeah. So a couple of things there. I think what one of the ladies was saying about return on investment, and no, it was, I can't remember who it was. Someone was talking about return on investment. And when I worked in private consultancy, I think I was very lucky, because over and over again, we were advising businesses about measures they could take to reduce their energy waste and water, right? And every single time we do a cost benefit analysis, and it would come back to NPV, IRR, and simple payback. And I think that discipline, I think the more that can be instilled in students at university level, I think that would be that's a really, really important, simple, valuable point to make to all students who might end up innovating, because that is the bread and butter of everything we do. I'd say that I would agree with that point on our ROI. And also what the lady was just saying then about supporting young businesses, young SMEs, and enabling them to pivot. I think that's one of the big strengths we've got as a small business, is we can pivot really quickly. You know, we can make a call one day. Like a month ago, we decided we're going to start growing microgreens. 2 weeks later, we bought the kit, we'd set it up, and we were doing it, you know. Like, we can do things really quick. But I must say the majority of our time is spent on marketing and sales, and filling out Innovate UK forms. It's not doing the stuff that we can actually make a difference doing. And I think if there's a way to get money into businesses like ours that are showing promise, that are going to do, I'm obviously I'm biased, but we're going to do good things, you know, so we can spend our time making a difference rather than filling out forms, that would really help. Yeah.
Got you. Ceri, did you want to come in?
It was briefly actually to what Faye said earlier about childcare. And when we ran a technology showcase with startup companies, we had some female founders from the region to the final two speakers, and they both said exactly that. They said that would have made a huge difference to them being able to accelerate their businesses. So yeah, and I just would also advocate Faye's point about a business coach. I've had a coach for about maybe about 10 years, and they make a huge difference. They really help you kind of assess your values and your vision. And actually it's enabled me to do the things that I like, and then I think you put more time and more passion into it, and probably become more innovative yourself. So, you know, just a few add-ons there. Thanks, Faye.
Right, thanks, Ceri, and welcome back, Paul. You obviously needed a
Joys
drink
of
already.
homework. Yes.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to jump about a bit because I want to ask this next question based on some of the thrust of where we've gone so far. Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, was quoted this week saying that fintech regulation is going to comprise tough love and disappointed ambitions, but out of it will come a robust form of innovation. So my question really is should government get out the way while and save the regulation till later, or can they create facilitating regulation Do you agree with Andrew Bailey that tough love and disappointed ambitions are worth the cost of a robust form of innovation?
I can always chip in the silence because I used to be very anti so-called red tape. And as a researcher, it seemed to always get in the way of things. But I'm a huge convert now in the medical sector, because we've seen so many medical device disasters that I teach my students about, some of which are still quite famous, the PIP breast implants, for example, some metal on metal bearing surfaces, but medicine is littered with disasters, which we now know, robust, carefully written risk-based regulations would have protected us from. So I now am an enthusiastic convert to good regulations, albeit in my sector. And I think as well, what's happened is that the public are no longer willing to be the guinea pigs for our research. Even in the pandemic, you can see a degree of skepticism in some quarters. And I think we have to make sure we keep the trust, and therefore knowing that the regulations are there to protect people is part of that process. And my final conversion, though, is actually that a country and a system with good regulations actually has a competitive advantage. It is the best place to innovate. And I think I've seen this, and I'm not sure what the impact of Brexit will be, but certainly up until recently, the MHRA were very highly regarded across the world, and I think they still will be. And people want to come here and innovate because they know that they're getting a good regulator alongside that complex ecosystem in which we innovate. Having a good regulator is an asset. So I'm not qualified to talk in all of the other regulatory areas, from environment through to fiscal, but certainly for medical devices, I think good regulations are an asset, not a handicap.
Thanks, Paul. Peter, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I think on this particular question, we need to probably, again, is another distinction point and definition point, distinguish between regulation and perhaps what's called, in a somewhat pejorative way, bureaucracy. So I was kind of taken by Faye's comment about, filling out forms and kind of, how that's kind of somehow taking up space for actually doing more innovation, because there's actually a process, overly complicated kind of process to go through to actually get access to, say, funding. So I think we probably need to be sort of careful around that. And I think when it comes to something like fintech, I think also recognize that some innovations are not being particularly valuable and created much value. If you think about, innovations in the financial services sector towards the end of the late 2000s, precipitating the global financial crisis and crash, no one would want to return to those types of innovations. CDOs, assets that kind of, going into huge bubbles and all the consequences of that. Clearly, there has to be some form of regulation. Otherwise, innovation can generate real negative values for us as a society and an economy, and we're picking up the tab as taxpayers for many years to come. So I think I agree with Paul about what type of regulation we're talking about. And I think there does have to be a role there in order to, particularly if, again, taxpayers are kind of investing resources into these sorts of things as well. And, trying to make a market or create a market, de-risk sort of investment, I think there should be some form of oversight and accountability and transparency for investment.
Thanks, Peter. Ceri?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, really interesting. My sense is I'm seeing a sort of quite highly linked to the tech sector, and you quite often see the sort of technological pace of change kind of outstrip the regulation. But at the same time, I'm really aware of, for example, some artificial intelligence algorithms, they're showing bias, and there's some really not very nice downstream consequences. So I don't know whether there's like a halfway house where you could have some kind of quite agile kind of regulation where the regulator is actually sufficiently embedded in that kind of innovation space that actually it's kind of working with the people to, have a kind of flexible system whereby it is keeping pace, but equally looking at some of the pros and cons of regulation. So maintaining the ability to be innovative and to be responsive, but also, you know, having those, you know, checks to make sure that we're not creating anything that's going to have an adverse effect.
Thanks, Ceri. Rachel, as one of the, it feels wrong to call you a bureaucrat. as part
Please
of
don't call me one of them.
As part of the local, potentially regulatory environment, what's your view on this one?
I think it's an interesting one. So to pick up on Faye's point, that that's a statement that we hear quite a lot of when somebody wants to apply for some funding, either through Innovate UK or through any other mechanism that's offering funding for innovation. There is a lot of paperwork to go through, and that can be quite prohibitive for a small business in particular in helping them to develop and move forward. And so whether that is that there needs to be less of the sheer volume, or whether that needs to be some advisory or some support to help small businesses apply, I think is a real case in point. I think when it comes to fintech, it's a real interesting one. We're dealing with a number of inward investment inquiries at the moment that are in the fintech and the financial services market. And I think because of what's happened and you know, Peter made reference to this, because of what's happened in the financial services sector with banks and with financial institutions, there has been, over the last few years, there's been a number of loopholes that technology companies have been able to get through. And so there is an absolute need to close some of those so that fintech companies are coming under the same rules and regulations that your high street banks are. But I think there's a difference in the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy that a small business goes through to fill in paperwork for getting a small grant to help them innovate than what you've got on the other end of the spectrum. Thanks,
Rachel. Faye, you raised your hand?
Yeah, just to give you an example. So at the back end of last year, one of my team applied for an Innovate UK. It was a UKRI fellowship. So if we were to win that, then her 80% of her wages would be paid over 5 years for her to do kind of like academic research that would support the business. So it'd be wonderful if we win it. It's a big prize, you know. So we put in a lot of work. I would say over a couple of months, this lady and myself, we put in a significant proportion of our time. Most of her time was spent on it, and I was monitoring and brought someone in to help. We put the application in. The website was awful. The support was poor. We got it in eventually, and then we got an email saying thank you for your application. Due to the high numbers, now bear in mind this was in September, October 2020. Due to the high number of applications we've had, we won't be able to process it until May 2022. And this is an innovation. This is an innovation application. I mean, our business is going to be completely different in 2022. So that's an example of what we're up against. And we had to have a serious conversation in-house. Is it even worth us bothering with this? If we'd have spent that time on sales, marketing, and actually writing stuff and doing the research we want to do, instead of writing that application, would we have got further? So, you know, we're wrestling in that. But I think in relation to regulation, I would say it would be helpful to, I think it's important, isn't it? I think we've got to live in the tension. I think we do need some rules and regulation, but what Ceri was saying about, can it be agile? You know, I've worked in the civil service before, and I know that people move around. So one day you might have got someone working in fintech who the month before might have been working in education, you know, and these people they're coming in new to things, and they're writing reams and reams of regulation, and it's, I'm not sure if there's a problem right in the system, you know, actually what's going on in the civil service.
Yeah, we're going to come on to Dominic Cummings later, actually. And you've just given me an idea for a tattoo. Live in the tension. I love that. Live in the tension. And perhaps that's as good a definition of innovation as we need, actually. So, yeah, let's talk Dominic Cummings very briefly. So he was a big advocate for this new Advanced Research and Invention Agency. and an £800 million investment has now been earmarked for that, for this area, modelled on the US model. This is meant to show that the government are prepared to invest in higher risk, the debased term moonshot innovations. Is it a role for government to de-risk and to put their money behind such things? Rachel.
I knew you'd come to me first. I think it depends on what the vision of both the UK and the local economies are in a post-Brexit world. And so if there is a vision to create more of a knowledge economy, or to be able to generate more IP and then scale it up and retain it in the UK, then yes, I think there is a role for government to de-risk some of that activity. Whether there's a long-term role and following the US model, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. Any other views on this one? Paul?
I've always got a view. I rarely agree with Dominic Cummings, but on this particular area, I agree very strongly with him. And that is simply that the country spends billions on R&D. The UKRI, where most of us in university get our funding from, have a budget of around, I think, 8 billion. Yeah, so 800 million is actually a relatively small sum. It may sound large, certainly to all of us, but as a national investment, it's quite small. And the reason I agree with it, is that 8 billion is largely spent on discovering new knowledge. Wonderful, very important. We have one of the best higher education sectors in the world, albeit the national R&D budget isn't as great as many leading economies in the world. But there's a big difference between discovering new knowledge, as we discussed earlier, and innovating and creating new products and processes that don't just make lives better and don't just earn money, but they also improve society. You know, they create the exports, for example, that bring money into our country. So they have. So innovation is fantastically important, and I think we should tilt the balance a bit more towards trying to get this new knowledge and turning it into innovation and success, with all of those benefits, including environmental and things we've touched on earlier. And I've just got one example, that we have, for example, within our group, we've got a patent application for an antimicrobial bone graft. The global market for that is 1.6 billion dollars, to be fair, not pounds. But I would estimate on the back of an envelope, we're a good £2 million away from having sufficient data to prove that this is worthy of private sector investment. And even at that point, I would think that some kind of new vehicle would be advantageous. And ARIA could be, I don't know yet all the details, but what I've seen is quite promising. It could be the very kind of nimble agency that's able to put together unique vehicles to get you that kind of, £2 to £10 million, that if successful would make the UK, and in fact a Sheffield company, Ceramicist, with whom we work, phenomenally. I mean, I cannot even begin to explain how important an antimicrobial bone graft would be, but it would transform hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide, and therefore this is the kind of place the government do step in. There's no way the private sector could gamble at this stage. But if we had that bit of data and it proved that our anticipation was correct, the payback would be unimaginable.
Great, thanks, Paul. And you've given us a second headline that we're tweeting even as we speak. Hatton backs Cummings in shock.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Peter, you've had your hand up.
Thanks, Chris. I do think there's a role for government. I mean, there's a lot of international evidence, people like Mariana Mazzucato talking about mission-based innovation, where governments have de-risked and invested resource, which has turned into hugely successful commercial products for many US companies in particular, but there's other examples across the world. So I can see the what they're trying to do with ARIA, and it makes, in some respects, sense. But I think in order to try and maximize its impact, though, then I think, a focus on particular societal challenges that we face, excuse me, not least climate change. This is the biggest crisis that we're facing as a planet, even despite the pandemic, and also that you're going to see much more huge growth in things like low carbon goods, products and services over the next 20 years. I think ARIA could play a key role in encouraging more collaboration, more co-creation, more diversity in order to sort of stimulate those inventive solutions. But I think how it sits within, and Paul mentioned the kind of UKRI infrastructure, I think there's a role there really for UKRI in order to enable ARIA to really concentrate its resources on delivering and imparting as much funding and financing as possible for frontline invention and research activities. That there should be a system that supports ARIA through things like back office systems from UKRI and IT. So not necessarily see these two entities, one fairly large, which UKRI is, and ARIA still relatively sort of small, but actually how they can work more collaboratively together in order to enable ARIA to really achieve that goal of it, to try and stimulate much more mission-based innovation activity.
Right, thanks, Peter. Faye or Ceri, have you got any particularly strong views on this one?
There you go. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that I don't know loads about ARIA. I know a little bit from listening to Radio 4 about how things work in the States, and it seems to be a lot quicker and faster, and then you get Silicon Valley as a result of that. I don't know enough really to comment on that, but what I would say is, from my own point of view, funding for innovation is great, fast tracking it is great, but sometimes we feel like we're innovating, but it's sometimes borderline whether we are or not. So we want to build greenhouses that use waste heat and CO2. We want to build them next to the sources of waste heat and CO2, right? So greenhouses aren't new. Using waste heat and waste CO2 isn't new. But when you put them both together, there's all sorts of challenges about how to get people on board with that and stakeholders and getting contracts signed. Well, there's all sorts of stuff to sort out. And that's the innovation, I think, there. And sometimes we fall between the cracks because we're not innovative enough, we're not tech enough, but it's such a common sense, sensible thing to do that it's an absolute no-brainer, but getting it funded is difficult. So I would say yes to ARIA, but please don't forget sometimes simple is best, and these complex social kind of awkward things, these barriers need to be overcome, and that can be where the innovation is. Yeah.
Thanks, Faye. Ceri.
Yeah, so I must admit I had heard of it, but I just wanted to look up like why was the UK thinking of following a US model, and it's the US Advanced Research Projects agencies that they've kind of based this on, and the reason is because the funding that's come out of these US agencies has led to things like GPS and the internet. So that's kind of why they're thinking this could be a good model. And I think, yes, I agree, it is required, because I think a lot of firms, whether small or large, they just don't have the kind of resources to fund this kind of blue sky research. So I think that's an important aspect. But like Paul said, we've also got to think, if we fund all of this great research, we've also got to think about the next steps and commercializing it, because I think the UK traditionally perhaps hasn't done the best job of that. I'm kind of thinking monoclonal antibodies, perhaps, we haven't got the reward after putting all the effort in. So that's important. And I think we need to keep an eye on the North in this. We need to get a piece of the pie, and really hold the government to account that they're going to reach that 2.4% target of GDP spend on UK R&D. So that was my little bit on that. But coming back to what Peter said and talking about net zero, recently, for 2 years, but not so much this year, but I have been aware and involved in a technology accelerator program that's been hosted by Barnsley Council, called IoT Tribe. And this year, the focus has been on net zero. And honestly, they've got 10 companies. I've just been blown away by the caliber of the businesses and the hugely innovative ideas that are coming out. And I think as a region, it would be brilliant if we kind of, I don't know, we're able to have more of a focus on actually what's here, what's in our region, and actually what we could apply. So potentially in some instances, we don't always have to be looking to government for this steer. We actually might have some real, nuggets locally, including, for example, what Paul was talking about. So I think we need to keep horizon scanning for all opportunities that could be in front of us.
Thanks, Ceri. Paul.
Yeah, and just similar, another thought, which I can't necessarily fully articulate, but it isn't just about the cash. Yeah, I mean, clearly we've touched on it a few times. It's about having the people with the right skills and the innovation environment populated by those people so that we make the best decisions, as well as having the cash to make it with. And the best example in my sector I can think of is that many years ago, the UK dominated the market and had all the intellectual property for dental composites. So when you go to the dentist, if you have a white filling, it's a dental composite. And ICI pretty much solved that technology overseas. We never really made a commercial success of it. And now dental composites are made in Germany, the USA and Japan. That's probably 95% of the tonnage of dental composites. And it's a really high added value product. And they have thousands of high added value jobs supporting an enormous supply chain in Japan, Germany and the USA. And we invented it here first, at least the key patents. There were some US patents, but the key patents on light curing, for example, were British. So I think it's not only spending the money, but how do we make sure we retain the exploitation and the job creation within the UK? That's absolutely key.
Thanks, Paul. Just an interesting aside, I think, on this one. So another question is around the intersection of sectors, and we've touched upon this a little bit already. And one great example during the pandemic was the Formula One racing teams working with the health sector on new ventilators with different technologies at speed, along with other such innovations. What I'm interested in exploring with you is how can we encourage greater levels of cross-fertilization, and maybe if we can touch upon co-location and remote technologies in that. So just generally, if I can open that one up to any views on that cross-fertilization. Faye.
I'll go. Yeah, I studied permaculture design in my 20s when I was like young and free and all of that stuff. One of the permaculture principles is about it talks about the intersections, basically. Like in nature, you've got where the sea meets the land, you get amazing things like coral reefs where the biodiversity is way bigger than it is in the sea or in the land per meter squared, and you see it all throughout nature. So I think the same thing applies when you look at crossing sectors in innovation, I think. So we, like I'm an engineer, but we cross sectors between energy and food. And we also cross sectors between in social structures as well. And we cross between public, private and third sectors also. So which is potentially brilliant. I think there's so many, 1 + 1 = about 6 with these projects, but the challenge is that we need to overcome, I would say, is that the local authorities that we have to work with are all often siloed. So the people who work in energy probably don't even know the people who work in food oftentimes, and the same with governments and funds. So there might be a fund to apply to, but it's about energy, and then there's a separate one for agriculture. And sometimes they are starting to merge a bit more now. But oftentimes the potential benefits that you can get through mixing all of these things together, the holistic solution, you can't capture them in a funding application because you're looking to tick their boxes. Do you know what I mean? So we've got this great big vision, but often we're having to squish it into someone else's tiny little box just to get the money, and then it dilutes it and it's not as effective. So I guess what can be done about that? Well, de-siloing, or just finding ways of encouraging people within local authorities to mix, within government departments to mix, within funding departments to mix, getting some inspiring information out there and education about holistic benefits. Yeah, for starters, I guess.
Right, thanks, Faye. Peter, and then I'll come to you, Ceri.
unmute myself, sorry about that. Thanks. Yes, I think I would agree that we want to encourage more intersection between different sectors. I think we need to sort of see and encourage that right from all the way through the kind of innovation system. So I'm thinking not just simply about R&D, but I'm also thinking the importance around skills and talent and developing talent there. So the government has got this intention to increase STEM and support for them, say in higher education, but is also talking about reducing funding for the arts and humanities and creative sort of side of things. I think we need both. I mean, a lot of turning innovative potential products into final marketable products has come as a consequence of the relationship and the joint working between those working on the innovation, but also design and creativity. And we're at risk if we're sort of saying, we're prioritizing one particular element over another. We need, as Faye rightly says, a integrated approach. So I would kind of caution against that and be slightly sort of concerned that we don't see the relationship between the creative industries and science. But just final point on your supplementary, I think, about physical co-location around innovation spaces. I think for a region like Yorkshire, and particularly say South Yorkshire, important about the role that innovation plays around urban renewal, development within our cities and within our towns. And I think whilst, yes, we're seeing and have seen more remote working, I think we just need to think through the kind of consequences of what that means for places, for cities and for towns in parts of Yorkshire, because innovation has been an important sort of driver around urban renewal and development. And so, I wouldn't necessarily want to see that lost.
Thanks, Peter. Really interesting. Ceri.
Thank you. Yeah. So what Faye was saying, and Peter touched on it as well, was like music to my ears. So I've been carrying out this project, and we've been interviewing business leaders and entrepreneurs across the South Yorkshire for the last few months. And essentially a big thing that's coming out of it is that our entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem is pretty fragmented and disconnected. So completely agree with Faye, and I would love to see less siloing, more partnership working, to the point of having kind of like maybe a joint infrastructure where actually organizations can come and work together and exchange, because I think there's some great gems in our region, but they tend to be quite standalone. So I think just imagine the strength that we could get from a kind of having shared missions across sort of multi-stakeholder groups. So I would really love to see that. And then so I'm a big one about for innovation coming from interfaces. So it's that's kind of what I do all the time. So I just captured a few ideas about how you do that. So typically I like to bring together people from the tech sector with, for example, manufacturing or healthcare. And I might do that through meetups or through hackathons, just ways to get people talking and integrating. I mentioned IoT Tribe and the startup companies on that. That's just like a perfect melting pot of bringing startups and corporates together along with funders, that type of thing. And I love working with university students, particularly engineers. I just think they're so innovative. They're just so creative. Getting them to work with companies through challenges or through internships. And then I think importantly, what we mustn't forget is this kind of, international flavour. And a lot of the work I've done with Barnsley Council has been around European projects where different cities work together in a kind of co-produced way to create digital strategies or different plans. And honestly, you see huge strength and progress when you start to bring people together and to collaborate. So it's all great stuff, and I'd love it to happen more in our region.
Thanks, Ceri. Rachel, any other views on this one?
I would just really actually agree with what Ceri said there. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is to find the right mechanism or find the right forum for facilitating bringing people together. I know a number of years ago, or a few years ago, when the oil and gas industry started going through serious decline or serious issues that it was going through. Actually, there was a hackathon that was developed with a number of tech companies that were based in London, and it proved hugely successful for both sectors really, and started to bring across that cross-fertilization of ideas in areas that you wouldn't generally put together. But the biggest challenge is finding how you actually bring the businesses together with either innovators or different sectors to create the solutions. Thanks,
Rachel. Well, I'm a bit disappointed to say we're near the end, because I feel like we're only just getting going, and this could be a task force after the insights we've had today. And I don't say that flippantly. You know, there's some really, really interesting insights from all perspectives. So just as a final kind of wrap-up question, are you optimistic about the future of innovation in a post-pandemic, post-Brexit UK?
Can I go first then? Because I answered all these questions on a piece of paper, and I wrote down here, can you be hugely and cautiously optimistic at the same time? Because that's how it feels. You know, I look at the innovation landscape and picking up on the previous points, you know, the multidisciplinarity, the solutions that both of our institutions, and I'm sure throughout Yorkshire, have found to bring people together across traditional boundaries, the talent and brilliance of our workforce. You know, there's so much to be positive about, but the challenges, you know, from the environment through to just trying to create innovation at a time when it's difficult, you know, are significant too. I suppose I take the long view as well, to finish the answer, which is, you know, human beings have never stopped innovating. And I don't want to sound naive in the sense that we, of course, will solve the problems, why worry, but human beings have been innovating since we crawled out of a cave, really. So it seems to be hardwired into the human species and human spirit. So I think we will innovate. I just worry in equal measure, you know, so that's why I kind of sit there both hugely and cautiously optimistic in the same breath.
Right, thanks, Paul. Faye, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. The thing that gives me most optimism at the moment is I keep getting calls from people, from investors and investment fund managers and stuff. We've got all this money sat in ethical funds that they want to spend on projects with strong ESG, environmental, social and governance. There's loads of money sat in that sector waiting to be spent, but they need the feasibility work. They need investment grade business cases first. So that I see that as the barrier. Got to get from here to investment grade business cases, and then we can bridge into all of that finance. So I'm talking my sector. I don't know so much about the others, but in my sector, low carbon, net zero, all of that. Yeah, I think it's going to be a really, really exciting 10 years. Yeah, I think we'll get there.
Thanks, Faye. Ceri?
Thanks. Yeah. So I think post-Brexit, you know, we really have been hit hard in a number of ways. I think, you know, for example, we've had to pull out of the Galileo satellite navigation collaboration. You know, after and having put so much in, that is a tough one. But in more positive sense, we are sort of still involved in some schemes such as Horizon Europe. But I do think, you know, that whole period of uncertainty, you know, has unsettled everybody in terms of some existing collaborations. So that's given me a lot of concern. And, you know, I certainly wasn't one for Brexit, but, you know, I have to live with the consequences, I suppose. But I think what's exciting for me is in a way, as a result of the pandemic, is this kind of receptivity to digital technology. And I heard someone speak from the NHS Digital, and they said they'd seen in the first 3 months of lockdown, they saw more progress in that 3 months than in the previous 12 years of having worked for the organisation. So that is really the silver lining for me, and that's giving me hope and you know, like optimism, like Paul says, for the future.
Thanks. Rachel or Peter, any other points of optimism? Peter?
Yeah, I do feel optimistic. I think what will help to realise that optimism more is that we support our talent, our future talent, to undertake and engage and lead innovation. And that's not just in universities, it's in further education as well, and it's between both HE and FE working collaboratively. And just as I think I said right at the outset in my opening remarks, that we see this as a inclusive exercise, not simply the preserve of a few people, but actually all of us, I would like to believe, have the propensity to be innovative. And I think there's so much sort of latent talent out there that we're just not able to kind of unleash, in the government's word. So I think let's find the mechanisms and routes to do that, and let's be inclusive.
Great, thanks, Peter. Rachel, last word.
Optimism. Yes, I would say I am optimistic, and I think there's an increased willingness and enthusiasm for development, both in a post-Brexit and a post-pandemic world. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about.
Right, thank you. So we can be hugely and cautiously optimistic as we live in the tension. So there's the subtitle for the podcast. Can I just say thank you so much to everybody for not just your time today, but the clear thought you've been putting into preparing for the session and considering the questions very seriously. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you today, and I hope we can do it again sometime and continue to influence the region and innovation within it. So I think it's in pretty safe hands if we can all pull together and keep going. So thank you again for today, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.